The sound of a tranquil waterfall blended with the chirp of morning birds, and the occasional clink of wine glasses filled the air until a shriek cut through it like a chainsaw through yoga mats. Karen, queen of the HOA and self-proclaimed spa goddess, was sprinting across my garden in a soggy white robe, dripping cucumber slices and essential oils, screaming, "It got in my hair." Behind her, a herd of panicked spa guests in matching robes flailed through rows of heirloom tomatoes, knocking over massage tables, kicking over lavender plants, and dragging eucalyptus-scented chaos behind them like a tornado made of glitter and embarrassment. And in the middle of it all, my skunks, tiny fluffy agents of karma, sniffing curiously at the invaders with their tails cocked just enough to warn, but not yet fire. It had all started 72 hours earlier when I made the mistake of attending a weekend wildlife conference out of town. I left my property, an acre of peaceful green tucked at the edge of the HOA neighborhood, in the care of my neighbor and good friend Thomas. The garden was more than a hobby. It was part of my federally licensed wildlife rehabilitation setup, specifically for skunks. I'd built habitats for injured or orphaned skunks over the years and become something of a local expert. Most neighbors respected the boundary signs and knew not to mess with the area. Most, not Karen. Karen had a knack for ignoring anything that didn't serve her. She was in her mid-50s, wore wide-brimmed hats like she was constantly on a runway in Tuscany, and believed the HOA bylaws were divine scripture personally handed to her by some bored suburban deity. She also had a history of repurposing community spaces, which is a nice way of saying she borrowed other people's yards, driveways, and even the occasional gazebo without asking. So when I got back Sunday evening and saw crushed mint plants, collapsed parasols, and a discarded Namaste and Hydrate sign lying face down in the dirt, I knew something had gone down. Thomas filled me in while trying not to laugh himself into a hernia. Apparently, Karen had announced a surprise spa pop-up on Saturday morning and marched onto my property with a small army of yoga instructors, masseuses, and spa guests, claiming she had verbal permission from me, which I hadn't given, of course. According to Thomas, she'd waved around a clipboard with fake sign-up sheets and barked at anyone who questioned her. It's a community health initiative. This garden needs love and purpose. She and her entourage had set up herbal foot baths in my raised beds, hot towels over my rosemary bushes, and God help us, some sort of facial tent that included dry ice fog and whale sounds on Bluetooth speakers. They trotted barefoot through the grassy lanes and into the outer reaches of the property, right where I clearly posted 3 signs warning about the active skunk habitat. Karen didn't care. "They're just cute little raccoons," she reportedly said while dragging a wicker table into place. "Besides, they'll love the aromatherapy." At some point, a guest had left an open container of scented oils near one of the habitats. Skunks are naturally docile but get defensive fast when cornered or overwhelmed with smells. Shadow, one of my oldest rescues and a retired therapy animal, must have been the first to react. The exact timeline is blurry, but what's clear is that the combination of peppermint mist, high-pitched laughter, and intrusive selfie sticks tipped the entire ecosystem into DEFCON 1. One by one, the skunks emerged, some out of curiosity, some probably trying to escape the overwhelming human perfumes, and others simply confused about the impromptu invasion. Karen's guests panicked. One woman tried to climb my pear tree, another dove behind the compost bin, but Karen, true to form, tried to maintain control by grabbing a broom and swinging it wildly while screaming, "I'm the HOA chair. I command you to stop." The skunks did not obey. I had trail cameras around the property. Reviewing the footage later felt like watching a nature documentary directed by a drunk sitcom writer. There was Karen, arms flailing, knocking over her own table of crystal healing bowls. There was a woman in a floral robe falling into the koi pond while clutching a bottle of eucalyptus mist. There was even a man trying to hide inside a pop-up tent that collapsed on him as a skunk wandered in after him, then promptly walked back out. The worst of it, at least for Karen, was the moment when Shadow, ears perked and tail raised, let out a spray that caught her directly in the back of her puffy hairstyle. Her scream, so shrill it almost knocked the drone camera from the air, signaled the end of the party. When I got home, my phone already had 5 voicemails, one from Karen herself, still gagging and threatening legal action, 2 from HOA members asking if they could get the recipe for the natural pest deterrent I'd apparently used, and 2 more from neighbors laughing so hard they could barely speak. It didn't take long before pictures from the spa disaster started circulating on the neighborhood group chat. Memes appeared within the hour. My personal favorite was a screenshot of Karen mid-scream, superimposed with the words, "When nature says no." Karen, however, was not amused. The next morning, she showed up at my door, still red-faced and blotchy despite what must have been 3 chemical showers. She smelled like a desperate war between skunk musk and a Yankee candle store. She pointed a trembling finger at my porch camera and said, "You'll hear from my lawyer. That was a targeted attack." I blinked. "You broke onto my land, scared my skunks, and assaulted my sage patch with lavender spritzers." She didn't even flinch. "You endangered my guests with wild animals. You'll pay for this." I watched her storm off, leaving a faint trail of flowery fog behind her. I turned to Shadow, who had waddled up to sit beside me on the porch. "Don't worry, buddy," I said. "She has no idea what she's up against." Shadow's tail twitched, and I swear, if Skunks could smirk, he was doing it. This wasn't over. Karen thought she could just steamroll over boundaries and come out smelling like roses, but the only scent she'd be leaving with was justice, bottled by nature itself. Karen didn't just leave my porch that morning with the smell of skunk clinging to her like a permanent accessory. She left with vengeance boiling behind her eyes. While most normal people would accept a healthy dose of humility and maybe some vinegar baths, Karen decided to launch a campaign of damage control so absurd it made the spa party look like a kindergarten mishap. By noon, I started getting texts from neighbors asking why Karen was going door to door in a floppy sun hat and oversized sunglasses, handing out homemade flyers that read, "Attacked by wild animals." A cautionary tale. One neighbor said she gave a speech about how I was harboring an unlicensed zoo and endangering the community. Another said Karen had tears in her eyes when she said, "I almost lost an eyelash to that beast." By dinner, half the neighborhood knew about her drama, and the other half were scrolling through the meme page, laughing at her expense. But things got serious when I received a formal letter on HOA stationery. It was as unhinged as it was official looking, accusing me of creating a hostile and unsanitary wildlife environment, and demanding I remove all skunks from the property within 10 days. It was signed by Karen herself, of course, along with 2 other board members who I'd never even spoken to. She had stapled 3 grainy photos of the attack to the back of the letter, one of her slipping in my garden, one mid-screen with Shadow in the background, and another with a foot in a compost pile, like it was evidence of landmines. I read it twice, then burst out laughing. Thomas, who was over helping me build a new habitat box, nearly dropped his drill when I showed him the paperwork. "She thinks this is court-worthy," he said between laughs. "This looks like she printed it during a fever dream." Still, the threat needed to be addressed. I wasn't about to let Karen rewrite the story and paint me as a skunk-wielding maniac. I responded with an email, attaching my wildlife rehabilitation license, a copy of the state permit allowing me to maintain skunk habitats under specific conditions, and a reminder that she had not only trespassed, but also disrupted a protected zone. I CC'd the entire HOA board. Karen responded within the hour, this time doubling down and accusing me of running a biohazard skunk farm in violation of HOA aesthetics and smell policies. She also threw in a passive-aggressive line about how she understood not everyone was equipped to maintain high community standards. The real kicker came the next morning when animal control knocked on my door. A tall, tired-looking man in khakis and a field jacket stood there with a clipboard and a tight-lipped smile. "Sorry to bother you," he said. "We got a report about aggressive wildlife. Mind if I take a look around?" I invited him in, showed him every inch of the habitat, the medical logs, and even let him meet Shadow and the others. Halfway through, he was crouched beside one of the dens, petting a skunk named Daisy while she sniffed his boot. "Yeah, this is not what I expected," he muttered. "We thought you had a rabid raccoon situation. That woman who filed the report said you were keeping wild animals in cages with human trash. I pulled out my folder of documentation, handed it to him, and he flipped through the pages with growing amusement. This is probably the most regulated backyard I've seen, he said. Mind if I take a few pictures just for the report? I nodded. He snapped some photos, gave Daisy one more gentle pat, and shook his head. Poor things must have been scared out of their minds with that crowd. I smiled. They handled it better than I would have. He paused at the gate on his way out. By the way, off the record, that woman smelled like a candle store exploded in a swamp. Maybe tell her to switch brands. I thought the visit would settle things, but Karen only took it as fuel. She posted a video to the neighborhood Facebook group titled My Survival Story, The Garden Terror. In it, she sat on a wicker chair, face full of makeup, sobbing gently as she described being sprayed by unknown chemicals and bravely shielding guests from a coordinated skunk attack. She said the trauma had left her unable to enjoy essential oils and claimed her yoga instructor was now in therapy. Comments ranged from supportive to skeptical, but one particularly savage reply stood out. A neighbor named Rochelle wrote, "Karen, you broke into someone's backyard and scared a bunch of rescue animals. You're not a victim, you're a walking sitcom." That comment alone got over 200 likes. Then came the lawsuit threat. A letter arrived from a law office that, upon quick search, turned out to be a one-room operation attached to a strip mall chiropractic clinic. It accused me of negligent harboring of dangerous animals and threatened civil damages for emotional duress, loss of social standing, and irreversible perfume trauma. I had to reread that last one 3 times. Shadow, napping nearby, looked up at me when I read it out loud and let out a snorting sound that almost sounded like a laugh. At this point, I realized Karen wasn't just trying to save face. She was trying to bulldoze my entire life's work to avoid accountability. I decided to go on offense. I compiled everything. The footage, the camera logs, the screenshots of her social media posts bragging about taking over the garden, the messages from neighbors confirming she didn't have my permission. I even got a written statement from Thomas and one from a former HOA member who'd quit last year because, in her words, Karen thought she was the monarch of suburbia. I submitted all of it to the HOA's internal review board and requested a formal disciplinary hearing against Karen for trespassing, community disruption, false reporting to animal control, and abuse of HOA authority. That same day, I handed the entire package to my attorney, who nearly fell out of his chair laughing at the perfume trauma claim. "We'll respond," he said, smirking, "but don't be surprised if this never makes it to a judge. No one's going to want to sit through a courtroom PowerPoint on lavender oil and tail spray." Still, the damage to my property and peace wasn't something I could laugh off entirely. My rosemary patch was flattened. My mint beds were stomped into green paste. I'd found several broken solar lights and even a crushed bird feeder that looked like it had been used as a footstool during someone's escape. I didn't want revenge for the sake of drama. I wanted restitution, but I also wanted Karen to realize something more painful than a fine or a court notice. I wanted her to see that she didn't control everything, that no matter how many robes she handed out or flyers she printed, she couldn't twist reality forever. And if she still couldn't understand boundaries, then maybe I'd have to show her again. Nature had already given her one warning shot. The next time, it wouldn't be an accident. It would be a full-on demonstration of why you never mess with someone's home, animals, or peace, especially not when that someone has an army of 4-legged skunk soldiers ready to defend the garden at any moment. By the time the HOA board scheduled a formal meeting to address my complaint and Karen's accusations, the entire neighborhood felt like it was split into 3 camps. The first camp was firmly Team Karen, mostly her yoga friends, a couple of nosy board members she bribed with organic muffins, and that one guy who seemed to support anything as long as there were flyers involved. The second camp, made up of rational neighbors, were tired of Karen's dramatics and just wanted their lives back. And then there was the third camp, spectators who treated the situation like a Netflix drama, complete with popcorn and bingo cards for Karen's next meltdown. The HOA meeting was held in the clubhouse's multi-purpose room, a space that usually hosted bunco nights and poorly attended holiday parties. But this time, every chair was filled. A projector stood in the corner, ominously waiting for visual evidence, and Karen sat in the front row with a silk scarf tied around her head like she was preparing to testify before Congress. I walked in with my attorney, a calm and confident woman named Jasmine who had handled everything from land disputes to HOA wars over flamingo lawn ornaments. She carried a binder thick enough to serve as a doorstop, filled with printed screenshots, time-stamped footage, and legal records confirming the legitimacy of my wildlife rehabilitation operation. Karen, meanwhile, clutched a manila folder as if it contained the secrets of the universe. She looked around the room with the smug satisfaction of someone who believed they were about to be crowned queen of neighborhood morality. The board chair, a man named Victor, who always looked vaguely startled, like he'd just been woken from a nap, called the meeting to order. He looked between the two of us and sighed, probably wondering how his volunteer role had turned into suburban courtroom drama. Karen went first. She launched into a 10-minute monologue peppered with terms like emotional scars, natural warfare, and botanical sabotage. She claimed I had failed to maintain acceptable visual and aromatic standards for the neighborhood and had knowingly weaponized wild animals by failing to control their exposure to guests. She also dramatically unveiled a stained white spa robe from a dry cleaner bag and held it up as if it were Exhibit A in a crime scene. One of the board members actually sneezed from the overwhelming scent of whatever perfume she had sprayed on it to mask the lingering skunk musk. Then came the real kicker. Karen announced that her yoga instructor, whom she claimed was emotionally devastated by the ambush, was filing a separate complaint for mental anguish and post-skunk stress disorder. At that point, someone in the back of the room snorted audibly and tried to disguise it as a cough. When it was my turn, I didn't even need to say much. Jasmine stood, opened the binder, and laid out the sequence of events with calm precision. She presented the permits, the letters from the Department of Wildlife, and the veterinary statements confirming the animals were not dangerous, not rabid, and not bred for defense. Then she played the footage from the garden cameras, and suddenly the room was silent. Everyone watched as Karen marched through the property, waving her clipboard like a baton, giving orders to set up spa tents right next to signs that clearly read, "Do not enter, wildlife zone." They watched her knock over a skunk trap, chase Shadow with a garden broom, and declare herself HOA royalty while stomping through the lavender bushes in high heels. The highlight, though, was the slow-motion replay of her slipping on a wet stone and landing butt first in a patch of mint, screaming about toxins, while a very unbothered skunk walked by without even spraying. By the time the lights came back on, even Victor looked embarrassed for her. Jasmine concluded with a simple question to the board. If this had happened to any of you in your backyard, without your permission, would you have remained calm and quiet? Or would you have done exactly what my client did, defend what he's legally and ethically built? Karen tried to recover. She launched into another emotional appeal, claiming that as a community leader, she should have been given a chance to mediate the situation herself without legal threat. She said she'd only acted because of the health and wellness of the neighborhood and claimed that the skunks posed a risk to property values. That was when I stood up and calmly said, "Karen, you held a spa party next to a skunk habitat, got sprayed, and then blamed the skunks. That's not leadership. That's lunacy." The board called for a break to deliberate. During the recess, a few neighbors came up and quietly thanked me for standing up to her. One woman whispered, "She tried to host a silent disco in my garage last year. You're a hero." Even Thomas showed up late, holding a container of brownies and asking if he missed the fireworks. I told him to save them for the next meeting because something told me Karen wasn't done yet. When the board reconvened, the decision was unanimous. Karen had violated multiple codes, including trespassing, misuse of private property, and endangerment of registered wildlife. Her request to have my wildlife license revoked was denied. Instead, she was issued a formal citation required to pay for the damages to my property and suspended from organizing any HOA events for the next 12 months. Her face turned bright red, then pale, then red again. She tried to argue, but Victor cut her off with a final, "Karen, This meeting is over." But even with her crown knocked sideways, Karen didn't retreat. The very next day, she started what she called her Restore the Neighborhood campaign. She set up a small table on the sidewalk in front of her house, complete with handouts, incense, and a sign that read, "Stop the Skunk Sanctuary." She claimed she was starting a petition to have the HOA bylaws rewritten to restrict dangerous animal rehabilitation in residential zones. She tried to appeal to families with small kids, warning them about feral fumes and unpredictable spraying. Her petition only gained 3 signatures in the first week, 2 from people she bribed with cupcakes and 1 from her cousin who didn't even live in the neighborhood. Meanwhile, my garden began to heal. The mint patch was regrowing, the rosemary was bouncing back, and I'd already started replacing the solar lights. Shadow and the others were back to their usual routines, with a few extra layers of fencing to give them peace. I even got a visit from a local environmental journalist who wanted to do a feature on urban wildlife rehab. She promised to include a segment titled, "When Skunks Teach Manners." I smiled as I led her through the garden, thinking that even though Karen had tried to drag me through the mud, all she'd really done was fertilize the soil for something better. She may have thought she could rewrite the rules, twist the story, and control the narrative, but in the end, nature has its own sense of balance, and Karen had just gotten a faceful of it. Karen's Sidewalk campaign, complete with pastel banners and a table stacked with aromatherapy candles, quickly became the neighborhood's favorite source of accidental entertainment. She sat out there almost daily, sipping herbal tea and nodding sagely as confused joggers passed by. Most people avoided eye contact, some out of embarrassment for her, others because they knew any eye contact could trigger a 10-minute monologue about toxic wildlife invasions. Her handouts now included a homemade pamphlet with a photoshopped image of a skunk with red eyes, snarling like a werewolf. She claimed my skunks were mutating from overexposure to mint oils and posed an evolving threat to peaceful community life. It would have been sad if it wasn't so absurd. While Karen was busy trying to drum up support for her anti-skunk agenda, I was already planning my next move. The court had ruled, the HOA had spoken, but I knew Karen wasn't going to stop until she either won or self-destructed in a fiery heap of peppermint delusion. So I decided to give her exactly what she wanted, or at least what she thought she wanted. I put together flyers of my own, this time announcing a neighborhood wildlife wellness day, hosted right in my garden. The event would be fully legal, family-friendly, and run by actual professionals. There would be skunk education stations, supervised animal viewing, DIY planter building for kids, and booths for local eco-businesses. I made sure to get HOA approval in writing, complete with permits and volunteer waivers. The event was 2 weeks away, and I knew Karen wouldn't be able to resist crashing it. In the days leading up to the event, Karen grew more frantic. She started accusing me of staging a nature cult and warning people that I was going to indoctrinate their children with skunk propaganda. Her rants were so over the top that the local Facebook group added a daily Karen Watch post where people shared sightings and quotes like she was some kind of wildlife of her own. One neighbor wrote, "Saw Karen today at the mailbox. She asked if I had noticed the neighborhood smelling different since the lawsuit. I told her it smelled like victory. But Karen's paranoia turned to desperation when she saw the flyer for the event. I had titled it Healing with Nature, Real Science, Real Animals, Real Respect. I even included a little skunk icon in the corner with a halo over its head. The morning of the event arrived, sunny and perfect. Volunteers set up booths along the edge of the garden. We had vet techs, wildlife officers, a few teachers from the local school, and even a small food truck offering organic snacks and lemon spritzers. By noon, families were streaming in. Kids were getting their hands dirty planting native herbs, while others watched quietly as a skunk named Buttons was gently introduced in a clear enclosure. Everything was calm, orderly, and designed to highlight the balance between humans and wildlife. Of course, Karen showed up. She arrived in what could only be described as safari couture, tan jumpsuit, wide-brimmed hat, oversized sunglasses, and a clipboard once again clutched like a legal weapon. Her entrance was unannounced and uninvited, but no one stopped her. I had instructed my volunteers not to engage unless necessary. Let her hang herself with her own rope. And she did. Karen walked directly up to the booth displaying the wildlife rehab licenses and barked, "Who authorized this?" A young volunteer calmly said, "The HOA board and the State Department of Wildlife." Karen huffed and moved on, circling the planter stations, sniffing as if expecting to find buried toxins. Finally, she marched up to the viewing area where Shadow was napping inside a shaded enclosure with glass panels. She tapped the glass with her pen and said, "This is animal cruelty. You've turned them into sideshow freaks." One of the rehab staff, a woman with the patience of a monk, gently explained that the skunks were not forced to do anything and were monitored for stress. Karen scoffed and turned to the crowd. "You're all being tricked. These animals are dangerous. This entire event is a PR stunt to distract from the fact that I was attacked in this very garden." I stepped forward calmly, microphone in hand, and said, "Karen, you're welcome to enjoy the event, but please don't frighten the children or the animals." She turned to me, eyes wide, and shouted, "This is not over. You're going to regret humiliating me." And then, as if the universe had been waiting for the perfect cue, a sudden gust of wind lifted one of the information booth banners. It flapped like a flag before detaching and slapping Karen square in the face. Her hat flew off, her clipboard clattered to the ground, and in her frantic attempt to recover, she stumbled backward, right into a large tub of compost tea that a volunteer had been using to demonstrate sustainable soil practices. The splash was magnificent. It soaked her from shoulders to shins, and the crowd collectively gasped. A moment later, a few kids started laughing. Then some parents chuckled. Before long, the entire area was giggling, even the skunks, who seemed to sense something hilarious had just occurred. Karen stood there, dripping and red-faced, staring at me like I had personally summoned the wind. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. Her reputation had already buried itself. She stormed off, leaving a wet trail behind her, and no one followed. In fact, several neighbors came up to thank me again, this time offering to help with future events. One woman said her daughter had fallen in love with the skunks and wanted to volunteer. Another said he had never seen Karen speechless before and would remember this day every time he smelled compost. The event wrapped up on a high note. We raised funds for the rehab center, signed up new volunteers, and even secured a small grant for additional enclosures. That night, as I cleaned up and locked the gates, I sat on my porch with Shadow beside me and watched the stars blink into the sky. I had expected resistance. I had even braced for sabotage. But what I didn't expect was how many people would rally when given the chance to see the truth for themselves. Karen's biggest weapon had always been noise, but when the community got a clear look without her interference, they saw what was real and worth protecting. Later that week, I learned Karen had tried to file another complaint, this time with the city. It was immediately dismissed. She was also warned about public disruption and told that if she continued harassing my event attendees, there would be consequences. Her table disappeared from the sidewalk, and the pastel banners vanished with it. No more flyers, no more sidewalk tea sessions. The neighborhood began to settle, quieter, calmer, with only the occasional waft of rosemary and mint riding the wind. Peace had returned, not because I fought fire with fire, but because sometimes the best revenge is letting someone show their true colors in front of a crowd, especially when they fall in a bucket of compost tea while doing it. For weeks after the compost tea incident, the neighborhood felt lighter. There was a sense of calm I hadn't realized we'd all been missing until Karen's storm finally passed. The sidewalk was no longer patrolled by passive-aggressive wellness crusaders. The HOA board meetings returned to mundane discussions about fence heights and parking spaces instead of emergency agendas centered on skunk-based warfare. Kids started waving at me again when they passed the garden, some even stopping by with their parents to peek in at Shadow or ask if they could help plant something. What had once been a tense, disputed boundary was now the heart of a quiet, curious community, and Karen was nowhere to be seen. But just when I thought the story had finally found its peaceful conclusion, a new twist slithered into view. Late one evening, as I was wrapping up paperwork in my home office, my email pinged with a subject line so ridiculous I nearly deleted it without reading. HOA leadership change proposal. Urgent support needed. Against my better judgment, I clicked. The message was from none other than Karen, masked behind a formal tone and a generic signature that simply read, Concerned Resident. She claimed that the current HOA board was unfit to lead, had allowed biological hazards to flourish unchecked, and failed to prioritize community wellness. She was proposing a special election to remove 3 city members, including Victor, and replace them with what she called proactive leadership. I laughed out loud, mostly because the list of replacement candidates she attached were all her yoga friends, including the woman who once tried to hide behind a compost bin during the spa fiasco. I could have ignored it. Most people did, but I knew Karen. She wasn't trying to win a majority. She was trying to wear people down. If she could cause enough noise, enough confusion, she might bully her way back into power the same way she had tried to bully her way into my garden. So I did something she wouldn't expect. I stepped into the spotlight. For the first time since moving into the neighborhood, I submitted my name for an open HOA liaison position, not just any role, but specifically for environmental and property boundary oversight. It was a small position, one Karen had often ignored, but now it had real meaning. And just like that, the final chapter of our strange saga began. The neighborhood held an open forum the following week for all prospective candidates. Karen arrived early, once again overdressed, and immediately began working the room like she was running for national office. She wore a beaded jacket and a name tag that read, Your Future, Your Voice, as if anyone had forgotten who she was. She gave a speech that started with vague promises about cleanliness and safety, and then rapidly descended into familiar territory. Mentions of traumatic garden events, references to rogue wildlife she claimed were still at large, and a veiled suggestion that the HOA had been compromised by skunk sympathizers. I stood quietly while she spoke, hands folded, not needing to interrupt. Her words were already digging her own rhetorical grave. When my turn came, I didn't grandstand. I simply explained the purpose of my wildlife rehabilitation work, detailed how I'd handled Karen's spa invasion without resorting to retaliation or escalation, and emphasized that community strength came from trust, not control. I reminded them that my door had always been open, even when hers was plastered with handmade signs and conditional hospitality. And then I ended by telling them what I told Shadow every night, that nature doesn't need to be feared. It needs to be respected. The room was quiet for a moment, then scattered applause broke out. Karen huffed audibly and muttered something about manipulation through cute animals. Voting took place the next day, and the results were posted that evening. I was elected to the position by a landslide, while Karen's proposal for leadership change was rejected outright. None of her hand-picked candidates received more than 5 votes. She didn't show up to the announcement. Word was she had packed up her sidewalk table and declared she needed a personal retreat. I imagined her sitting in her living room, drowning in scented candles, plotting her next comeback. But this time, the neighborhood wouldn't be listening. Her echo chamber had finally collapsed in on itself. Over the following weeks, I worked with the board to set up clear guidelines for private property, reinforce wildlife protection notices, and even launch a seasonal neighborhood nature day that invited residents to learn about coexisting with local animals. We had guest speakers, school participation, and yes, Shadow was the unofficial mascot. Kids loved him, seniors asked questions. Even the most skeptical neighbors walked away understanding that skunks weren't enemies. They were just misunderstood creatures trying to live, same as the rest of us. One afternoon, as I was out watering the rosemary bed, I noticed a delivery truck pulling up to Karen's driveway. She hadn't moved away, though she'd gone quiet, her mailbox now missing its usual parade of flyers and announcements. The driver dropped off a box and left quickly. Out of idle curiosity, I walked over after an hour to find the package still sitting on the porch. A small label read Organic Skunk Repellent Kit. I laughed, not because she had bought it, but because it claimed to use peppermint oil, exactly the scent that had first triggered Shadow's legendary response. It felt like poetic irony wrapped in cardboard. The truth is, I never wanted to embarrass Karen. I didn't enjoy her humiliation. What I wanted was peace. I wanted to grow my garden, care for my rescues, and share that small piece of harmony with anyone who approached with good intentions. Karen came in with the belief that she could dominate that space, mold it into her vision, and erase anything that didn't match. But life, especially nature, doesn't bend to ego. It pushes back, sometimes in ways we don't expect, sometimes with consequences that smell worse than pride can wash away. As spring gave way to summer, my garden flourished. The mint came back strong, the lavender bloomed purple and proud, and the skunks lounged lazily in the shade, safe and at home. I built a new enclosure, bigger, quieter, better. I named it the Serenity Pen. Shadow had his own cozy nook lined with soft moss, and every now and then, when the breeze blew just right, I could almost swear I saw him tilt his head toward Karen's house and smirk. The war was over, not because I won, but because the neighborhood chose sanity over spectacle. Karen's downfall wasn't caused by me or my animals. It came from her own refusal to listen, to respect, to coexist. In the end, it wasn't a skunk that brought her down. It was the truth, plain and simple. Last week, I spotted Karen in the grocery store. She was in the produce section, carefully examining organic cucumbers. When she saw me, she froze for a moment, then straightened her posture and lifted her chin. I expected her to turn away or scowl, but instead, she gave me a tight nod, the briefest acknowledgement of my existence. "Good cucumbers this season," I said casually. She looked surprised but replied, "Yes, the local ones are better." And with that small exchange, without dramatics or scented oils or HOA letterhead, we established something like a truce. Not friendship, not forgiveness, but a tiny crack in the wall of hostility, enough for the light of civility to shine through. As I walked home with my groceries, I thought about telling Shadow about this unexpected moment. He'd probably just blink those dark eyes of his, unimpressed by human reconciliation when there were sunbeams to nap in and earthworms to investigate. Nature doesn't hold grudges. It adapts, it heals, it moves forward. Maybe there's a lesson in that for all of us, even for people like Karen, who might someday learn that the best kind of control is knowing when to let go. For now, though, I'm content with my small victory. A garden reclaimed, a community strengthened, and a subtle reminder that sometimes the best defense against chaos isn't more chaos. It's a well-placed skunk with perfect timing.